good evening to everyone. Thank you for being here. This is terrific and very encouraging indeed, as indeed was the conversation I had with the interns earlier on. And thank you to those interns who came. It was tremendously encouraging to find among them someone who actually knew something about the changes we tried to introduce a few years ago to the military justice system. Fantastic. I didn't think anybody had noticed. Good on you for that. Of course, the High Court's overturned what we did, so we'll have to start again. But it's good that there is interest here. On New Zealand, Jeff, you remember many years ago when you wanted to travel overseas in the Department of Foreign Affairs or anywhere in the government, you had to go to an outfit called the Overseas Visit Committee. In a government committee, not the Overseas Visit Committee, but the Overseas Visit Committee, so there's only one. But New Zealand was not counted. That was counted as a domestic trip. So you haven't yet broken through. Anyway, thanks for that introduction. Yes, I retired in 2006 and expected to have a quiet life then, but it didn't turn out that way, and people keep asking me to do things, so I'm now looking to engineer a second retirement, or maybe a first retirement for a second career, but we'll see. Now, Jeff talked about what I would be talking about based on some earlier suggestions I'd made to him, but subsequently I saw the flyer that the branch here had put around about what I talked about, and I thought that sounded a hell of a lot more interesting than what I had in mind. So if you don't mind, I've gone away and married these two ideas, and we'll see what sort of a union it produces. I'll first say something about the changing disposition of power in the world, then I'll move on to the subject that was raised in the flyer of the Indian Ocean and India. Say something a bit about West Asia, and since I am the special envoy for Afghanistan, about that country too. I'll offer a couple of brief thoughts, yes, on that issue of the China-US-Australia triangle, and after that perhaps a few words about the forced posture review which I was involved in last year, and about the white paper, and then to that subject about rediscovering foreign policy. Now that's a pretty ambitious, if not pretentious, agenda, so I'll just put my watch here and make sure we don't murder it. Now let's start at the top then, the very big picture, the shift in economic weight and influence, of course, from the North Atlantic to Asia and now beyond, has been commented on widely in the last couple of years. There's no clear consensus about its meaning and consequences, but there is no doubt that great change is afoot. The Western world, the West, is not going away, but it will be less important in economic and political influence in the future than it has been for the last 200 years or more. The credibility of what's called the West, so cherished by countries like ours for so long, is at serious risk. And questions arise then about whether the Western consensus eroding, the consensus that is, that emphasises market economies and democracy and sees those two things as inextricably linked and privileges the rights of individuals. These are big issues, and I've no better place to comment on them than many of you here tonight, but I'll offer just two thoughts. First, we will have to get used to the idea of the major international institutions running differently, much less to our satisfaction and the way we would like it than has been so since 1945. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and ISBA, more likely ISBA, that is India, South Africa, IBSA, sorry, India, Brazil, South Africa, will have the numbers in the voting forums. You note that last formula, IBSA excludes China. That group, IBSA, is much more active in the forums than the China included group. They will have the numbers, and they will use them more effectively in their interests than the G77 ever did. And within a decade, the IMF and the World Bank will be run by non-Americans. The IMF very nearly was taken over by the new managing director this year when DSK fell. Perhaps it should have been, and certainly Australia supported the Mexican candidate. My guess is that Christine Lagarde, as the first woman head of that, will be the last European. There is a new American, of course, head of the World Bank, not a banker. He may well be the last American, as the head of that institution. Those things will run differently from what we know. Now, I'm not suggesting that we need to despair about that, so that all of it's going the way of the ICC since the Indian Cricket Board came to dominate it, but it is changing as just one area of consequence from the global economic and power shifts. Second, to relate all of this to our defence theme, a generation ago someone said, and it was probably Gareth Evans, but he used to say it, whether he originated or not, I don't know. He said we needed to be seeking security with Asia, not from it. Now that became a cliche and it sank into the record. But I was thinking about it again recently. You know, there were good reasons for that statement back a generation ago when it was first made, and the point then had many layers to its meaning. But now there's another layer, that is that the alternative is much less viable than it might have been a generation ago. The West, on which we might have depended had we chosen the alternative, that is in seeking security from Asia, is now a relatively much less potent force, likely to be much less helpful should we choose that course. I recently spoke to the AIIA in Perth, and of course you can't talk about the changing world there without talking about the Indian Ocean. That's not new, of course. Many of us here will remember Gordon Freeth, Foreign Minister, External Affairs Minister briefly in 1969, who made a statement whose origin I think some of us here remember, to the effect that we needn't worry too much about the Soviet Union in the Indian Ocean. He was then the target of a campaign by the League of Rights in the seat of Forest, and he lost his seat. Then 20 years later, Kim Beazley happened along and discovered the Indian Ocean too, and we heard a lot about it then. Then Stephen Smith became Foreign and Defence Minister. We continue to hear about it. But there is now greater interest in the Indian Ocean beyond just Western Australia, and reasonably so. As your flyer reminded us, Robert Kaplan stepped into that market at precisely the right time a couple of years ago, and did well out of his assertion that the Indian Ocean would play a crucial role in the battle for international supremacy in the 21st century. Now, I don't happen to buy all of what Robert Kaplan said. I think his book Monsoon is a terrific read, especially if you like travelogues. But his understanding of the strategic importance of the Indian Ocean was very different from the way that the commentators presented what he said. And by the way, in a book about the Indian Ocean, he managed only 12 references to Australia in 350 pages, and 2 of those, incidentally, were to Greg Sheridan. Now, that said, you know, the Indian Ocean is contended will become as important in strategic and global political terms of the Pacific. That's the assertion, and that's the one I doubt. Not least because, in my view, the Indian Ocean is not bordered by the US, China, and Japan. And anyway, the globally important Indian Ocean, which has got Kaplan and some Western Australians are so excited, is not exactly that bit of water which washes Cottesloe Beach. But the Indian Ocean region will be important, and it's worth unpacking why. Let me suggest 4 reasons. First, the region includes some of the world's most critical sea lanes, including the 4 choke points that carry enormous volumes of critically important energy and resources and other cargoes to and from Asia. The Straits of Malacca, Bab el-Mandeb, the Straits of Hormuz and the Sunda Straits, plus others to the north of Australia, which matter very much to us and to our trading partners to the north. Second, there is the fact that the Persian Gulf, with all its wealth and political issues, is in fact part of the Indian Ocean, and is much needed and competed for products that travel through that part of the Indian Ocean. Third, there are the failed or failing or struggling states on the Indian Ocean littoral, Somalia, potentially Pakistan and others, which are sources of political stress and great human misery and give rise to international crime like piracy and terrorism. Fourth, there is the importance of ocean and seabed resources, hitherto largely untapped in the Indian Ocean. They will have to be harvested and mined, and there will be competition for them, but regimes for doing so are not yet in place, and working them up will be difficult and contentious. In my view, those four issues don't together make the Indian Ocean a strategic entity in the sense that the Pacific is. But they do mean that managing our interests in the Indian Ocean region is going to require more attention in the future than it's had in the past. The strategic doomsayers see great scope for competition and rivalry and even conflict between India and China and even the United States in the Indian Ocean. To me, there's no reason why this should happen. No one power can or needs to control the Indian Ocean or its sea lanes, and the cost of trying to gain supremacy would likely be beyond the resources of any of those potentially interested. Call me naive, but to me the best and most obvious and cost-effective solution would be for the Indian Ocean, or at least for the sea lanes, to be seen as an agreed global common in which all states benefit from free and unfettered access. One of the current preoccupations of strategists and foreign ministries as well, and they're different, is to try to devise an architecture for handling the Indian Ocean and its issues. The problem is, of course, the four issues I've listed are related only by the fact that they are in and around the Indian Ocean. Another is India's determination to dominate any regional body which as much as shows an interest in the region. And the third is that some of the reasons for the importance of the Indian Ocean embrace the interests of non-Indian Ocean countries, US, Japan and China, but three. So, how to handle all of this? One solution might be to take a two-tiered approach. At one level, the level of high politics or strategy, we could look at the idea of an Indo-Pacific region or set of strategic interests. That is, to see the sea lanes as part of a continuum of ocean highways which extend from the Persian Gulf to China, Japan and the west coast of the United States, and to deal with them in the context of the existing high-level Asia-Pacific regional bodies like the EAS, APEC maybe, the ARF, the Shangri-La Dialogue and so on. At the second level, we could then try to deal with the genuinely Indian Ocean specific issues in an Indian Ocean specialist body. There is in fact such a body called IOARC. It hasn't been terribly effective to date, but freed of any aspiration for becoming strategically significant and asked to do a practical Indian Ocean focused job, it might become so. This incidentally, this two-tiered approach is how we deal with the Pacific. The big issues are dealt with, or should be, in the big forums I've talked about. The practical and local issues in the South Pacific Forum or Commission. That's the sort of model that I could see for the Indian Ocean and its issues. And so to India, which is of course very much part of the new world to which power of one sort or another is shifting. Australia's relationships on a new footing, not so much because we've changed, but because India has. We struggled for decades to find much common ground. We rabbited on about Commonwealth and cricket and curry and so on. But we were essentially these two countries on the wrong side of the divides. We as a trading nation, India as an introspective economy, we openly aligned with the United States, India non-aligned, or worse, after August the 9th, 1971. We too British, India still in a love-hate relationship with Britain. Much of that has changed since India's economic opening and coming out and the end of the Cold War. We now have many more shared interests, trade is growing rapidly, investment prospects are good, the business links we've foreseen for years are at last becoming real. And as well, there are new opportunities for engagement on shared political and strategic interests. But let me enter two notes of caution. First, I personally don't foresee India becoming a great power, a major, even great economy, yes, though perhaps not as quickly as some would forecast, but a great power, no, not another China. Remembering here that political or strategic power and economic weight don't automatically go to work together, as we know from Japan's history. Second, it would be a mistake to think that India has simply moved into the pro-US camp and that it can be dealt with as some kind of counterweight to China. In some ways and on some issues, India will work with the US, but mostly it will make its own judgments on where it stands issue by issue. At risk of being a little bit cute, I'd say that while Australia is in a permanent marriage with the United States and has been for whatever it is since 1941, India will pick its partners according to the outing on offer. Whereas we, as it were, are strategically faithful, India, to put it crudely, will be promiscuous as a matter of policy choice. To aspire to a relationship with India premised on any other assumption would be to invite disappointment. West Asia, then beyond India, let me say something about that region which stretches from Bombay to Beirut. It is the world's nightmare. We in Australia have been anxious for generations about East Asia, the Koreas, Taiwan, South China Sea, China, Japan and so on. But in fact, for 30 years or more, there's been barely a shot fired in anger east of Bombay. Yet the North Koreans sank a boat and so on. But in terms of serious interstate conflict, not since the late 70s. The bloodiest actions of the last 30 years then have been in that region between Bombay and Beirut. And sadly, that looks likely to continue to be the case. Let's just think about that. Think about that region, bookended by those two great decisions of post-World War international community. The partition of Pakistan and Kashmir, the creation of Israel. They're the bookends. In the middle of that, Iran. On one side of Iran, Iraq and Syria. On the other side, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Beneath that, this little string of Gulf states, vulnerable and anxious, understandably so. In that region, the great issues of our time have their origins. The Israel-Palestine issue, of course, the Kashmir issue, both of which in their own way did so much to radicalize Islam. Weapons proliferation issues, including nuclear, terrorism, civilizational conflict, if you believe in that, massive energy concentrations and potentials for competition. And now the Arab Spring is affecting much of it, opening up again, among other things, the spectre of Sunni versus Shia, a matter on which, incidentally, there was an interesting comment on the radio today about some tensions between Sunni and Shia communities in Australia. I think that is something to keep your ear open for. Prediction about this region is impossible, other than that nothing will be easy. There are no straightforward solutions, and we'll have to continue to work very hard to find any unequivocally good news. And as I was reminded when I was in Iran 2 weeks ago, there are starkly different ways of viewing West Asia and its issues, parallel universes. Historically, Australia has taken a complex, if not contradictory, view of West Asia. On the one hand, it's far away and the issues are enormous, beyond our capacity to influence. On the other, for nearly 100 years we've been deploying troops there in 2 world wars, successive UN missions, 2 Iraq wars, and now Afghanistan. Will we continue to do so in the future? That's a very big question. Yes, we have big interests in West Asia relating both to global security and to our specific economic well-being. But the cost of fitting out and configuring our forces for service in this region, and the cost of deploying them there and sustaining and supporting and rehabilitating them, has been huge. Governments will need to decide how much of this they can afford in the future. Because I've been fairly close to Afghanistan issue now for some 3 years as special envoy, you might expect me to say something about it. And in doing so, let me say on this matter, if not on anything else I say tonight, I speak for the government as I attend to this issue. At one level, what you see in the media is what you've got. But in fact, the position is a bit more complex and layered than is sometimes suggested. 3 points are worth emphasising. First, the transition to Afghan authority and Afghan leadership in the field is well underway. ISAF troops representing the 50 nations of the coalition will be substantially drawn down by the end of 2014. But they won't all go away, and there will continue to be a significant role for coalition of some kind there after 2014, including support for a substantial Afghan security and in providing substantial amounts of aid. It is essential to avoid a repeat of 1989 or 92. 89, of course, when the Soviet army withdrew from Afghanistan, and we all said, thank God that's over, and turned our back, and Afghanistan spiraled down into civil war, from which the Taliban triumphed. And secondly, 92, when the final funding for the Afghan security forces ran out, the army dissipated and the Taliban began to overrun them. Those are the key messages. Learning those lessons, not repeating 89 and 92, that requires a substantial investment in the future. Second point, the going remains very tough. Real gains have been made in the security field, but they're fragile still. That's the nature of insurgents. It doesn't take many insurgents, particularly if they're suicide bombers, to crank up an attack in a built-up urban area, and many rural areas remain vulnerable for a range of reasons of governance, warlordism, and so on. Third, all that said, in my view, Afghanistan cannot now go back to what it was in 2001. Al-Qaeda is mostly beaten and it's separated from the Taliban, and beyond that, there have been huge changes in the country. Ring roads and other access roads, 40 television and radio stations, newspapers, 9 million plus mobile telephones, children including girls at school, 40 plus women in parliament, the makings at least of a vibrant civil society and so on. The lights are on and they can't be switched off. A negotiated outcome which embraced some at least of the Taliban would be good. Most insurgencies end that way, and that's been an aim for some time. But it won't be easy, it's not proving easy, and certainly requires continued pressure in other areas, both from the military and from regional countries. And a benign approach by those regional countries, Pakistan and Iran, not the least of them, will also be important. I attended a conference of foreign ministers, not that I'm one, but I'm an enduring presence at these things, in Kabul 2 weeks ago that was in fact about trying to ensure just that process among regional countries led by Turkey, to which all the countries in the region have signed on. China, Russia is included, as well as Pakistan, Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkey and so on, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and they attended at the level of their foreign ministers, which was welcome. Small steps, but that's the best you can do. In all of this, we must never forget Afghan politics. It's not always to our liking, it's very often not, but it's always a factor, and it's a reality that we have to live with. It's something that Afghans are entitled to, and after all, the constitution they have, which the international community visited upon them, does provide for an election about once every 2 years for the next 30 years. So politics will be alive and well. And in that regard, the 2014 presidential election will be especially important for Afghans and the international community alike. It will be the capstone of the real test of the transition policy and process. I've mentioned the international community a couple of times. It's worth noting here that Afghanistan is arguably the biggest, most consensual international project of the last 50 years or so. For 10 successive years, the UN Security Council has renewed a full Chapter 7 mandate resolution, 10 years in a row. Even now, the ISAF coalition includes 50 members, and the International Support Group, the countries which meet regularly to review the aid programs, press on governance, and so on, includes, in addition to those 50, China, Japan, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and others. It's easy to compare Afghanistan with Vietnam, but in this, as in many other senses, it is very different indeed. And for those who would question Australia's involvement there, I would ask simply, would any Australian government of the last 60 years not have bought into a project with this much international support and involvement? I can't imagine that they would have. I was, as I mentioned, in Iran 2 weeks ago talking about Afghanistan and found again a remarkable degree of agreement even there about the outcome we're seeking in Afghanistan. And indeed, Australia's policies were described as good, and the Iranian foreign minister was at the regional support meeting I went to in Kabul, and that at least gives some encouragement there. I said I'd say something about that most mooted of all strategic policy issues facing Australia, that is how we manage our relationships with the US, our major strategic and security partner, and China, our major economic partner. As it's often been said, we face now a situation in which our major economic partner is not a member of the same security alliance construct as Australia. This hasn't happened before. How can we cope? There's an infinite amount that can be said and has been said and is being said out there about all of that. I just want to contribute 4 simple thoughts. First, it's a pity that so much of the discussion in this country on this subject runs on parallel tracks. The economists and business leaders on one track, the military strategists on another. Some might say that the government itself and the opposition need to do more to bring those 2 parallel lines of debate together. I think we all hope that the Asian White Paper, on which Ken Henry is working, will achieve that. Essentially, of course, what we must do is walk both sides of the street, but that doesn't imply or require ambiguity, much less duplicity. We must do more to avoid those perceptions with both partners. Second, Australia is not alone in facing this apparent contradiction between its economic interests and its traditionally perceived security interests. Most of the countries of the region do too, including Japan and Korea, and of course, above all, the US is, after all, China's largest trading partner and vice versa, and the US and Chinese economic interests are more interlocked than those of any 2 countries. Third, the notion that conflict between the US and China is inevitable or even likely needs to be contested. Don't let it grow. As a framework for setting policy, it's high risk and could lead to some false or premature choices. And of course, it suggests we've learned nothing from the past, in particular about the importance of open economies and the need to ensure that rising powers have access to markets, resources and Lebensraum. And finally, let's not be drawn into believing that the Australia-China relationship is asymmetric, that we are no more than minor demandeurs on China. Our resource wealth ensures otherwise, and anyway, we are, after all, the world's 14th biggest economy. We have the 13th biggest defence budget still. 142 of the UN's 192 member states are smaller than us in population, and as Paul Keating was fond of saying, we have a continent of our own. Of all this, the Chinese are very conscious. And so to the defence issues more directly. Earlier this year, Alan Hawker, former Defence Secretary colleague, and I concluded for the government a review of the Australian Defence Force posture. Now that doesn't mean the way they sit or stand. You know, we're going to keep the slouch hat, don't worry. It means where is the Defence Force positioned around Australia? Where are its strategic bases? Where are its operating bases? Are they in the right places? The terms of reference focused heavily on the north. Broadly, 2 outcomes from that. One, we didn't see a need to build much that was new in the north or to move forces further north. But we did see a need for a more active presence in the north, in particular off northwestern Australia, where, of course, a massive economic development is going on. In shorthand, something as big as important as Qatar, as a source of world energy, is emerging between Northwest Cape and East Timor. That is a region thus of global strategic significance, and there is the iron ore in addition. In all of that, for instance, at Port Hedland Harbour, the day I was there were 10 ships of 200,000 tonnes plus in the harbour, and there were 48 waiting offshore. This is massive. It needs to be seen to be understood, and the ADF is barely there. The Navy needs to be seen there for 3 reasons, and I'm not suggesting in any sense a threat, but it needs to be there to ensure that it's familiar with what is going on, that it knows where the sea lanes and channels are, that it knows how to relate to the oil and gas rigs, and which ones it could land helicopters on and which ones couldn't, and so on. Secondly, there is the whole issue of assurance. To the companies concerned, they raise this issue. The year goes by, they don't see a Royal Australian Navy ship, they don't see a person in uniform. Does anyone care about them? Do we know what's happening up there? That kind of assurance. And Thirdly, we do need to say, given the volume of international investment and international shipping and other traffic through the region, this is ours, we care about it, and we're capable. That's all we need to do. We're not recognising a threat, we're just, in old-fashioned terms, showing a flag there. It doesn't require a lot, but happy to say the ADF has seized onto that and is doing, I think, what is now needed, or will begin to. The second conclusion was from our report that we need to develop the existing facilities to enable the next generation of ships and aircraft to use them. Darwin, the port and the airfield, Tyndall airfield, Cocos Island even, Learmonth. The next generation of ships is bigger, particularly the LHDs of 27,000 tonnes. We need to be sure they can dock in northern ports, especially Darwin. They can't at present. And the next generation of aircraft, not just fighter aircraft, but air-to-air tankers and heavy lift aircraft and surveillance aircraft need longer and stronger runways, and there has to be a big investment in that, and that includes Cocos Island. I'll come back to that. While we were working on all of that, the decision about the US use of Northern Australian facilities was announced, but that didn't impact much on our work, other than to the extent that the US and Australian forces would share some of the upgraded facilities that I'm talking about, in particular the Bradshaw training area and Mount Bundy, which is, after all, the essential reason why they are there. Needless to say, the media coverage about possible American use of HMAS Sterling and of Cocos Island went much beyond what we wrote about, or that I think we need to frankly envisage, or that the Americans are thinking about even at this stage. To the White Paper, as the flyer noticed, I am a member of the Ministerial Advisory Group on the White Paper, which the Prime Minister recently announced would be completed in May 2013. There's not much I can say about this because the advisory group's not yet met. And so for me, the work's not yet begun. The Prime Minister in her announcement explained why we need a new White Paper so soon after the last one. I won't elaborate on that. But for many observers, me included, what she said reminded me of Arthur Tang's famous dictum, before you talk strategy, talk money. When we do start work, my group that is, I will add, and I know the defence is working away, but when we start work, I'll have a number of questions in mind, including how much money will be available over the next 20 years? What price or value or worth do we attach to the notion of strategic weight, that is, a credible defence force for the sake of having a credible defence force, which is recognised as such in our region? Thirdly, what does the term self-reliance, which has been used in every white paper since 1987, what does that mean in practice? Is more or less dependence on the US better for our interests in Asia? Those are the sorts of questions I think that we will be asking. And that leads me to the last point I want to make before I invite your comments or responses, and that is about the need, as I've put it elsewhere, to rediscover foreign policy. The culture of foreign policy, in what I would regard as the full or proper sense, is never, in my view, been deeply rooted in our country. Perhaps, as some have said, because we're an island nation and the importance of getting along with others has not been as deeply ingrained, or perhaps for other reasons that are beyond this discussion tonight. But this is an issue which is attracting some attention now in other countries like our own, and deserves attention here too, though not in any expectation that the government resources will be, more government resources will be allocated to diplomacy or foreign policy. That, I'm afraid, won't happen in the foreseeable future. Ironically, though, I expect that now that defence organisations in many of these like-minded countries are having their budgets cut, we'll begin to hear more again about how foreign policy and diplomacy will have to step up to the task of addressing the big issues again. I just hope we haven't forgotten how. I think it isn't possible. Firstly, because they won't be big enough or strong enough, and secondly, because others wouldn't let that happen. And thirdly, I mean, dominating an ocean is just an immensely difficult task, and the United States sort of did it until somebody pushed back in the Pacific, but that took, what, a 600-ship navy. It really is, I think, not a risk. And I keep coming back to this point, why would you want to? The trade which goes through all those choke points benefits all of them, including India. So, and there's not a risk from any one of them, unless one of them, for reasons that are not so rational, presses on the issues. No, as I was saying to the interns earlier, a couple of points here. One is the Chinese have got no reason to be concerned about that in any military sense. As Paul Keating said to Wang Qishan a couple of weeks ago, on any given day you've got twice that many coppers in Tiananmen Square. 2,500 Marines in Darwin makes an enormous difference to Darwin, but none at all to China. The important thing about that is, from the Chinese point of view, I'm sure, is what they see as the signal it sends about the extent of Australia's beholdenness to the United States. I think the intention of the signal was, from the Australian side, was to, to say, look, the United States is still around, it's still in the Western Pacific, and that's important to the security of the region. But the message is sent to the Chinese is the other one, and I think it has caused them some consternation for that reason. To what extent then can they rely on Australia as either as an economic partner, if it is thus beholden? The point that is not made perhaps as well in this, that may be a bit cute, but it's worth saying to Chinese, is actually, if you're looking for more room in the Pacific for your own Navy and forces, this is no bad thing. It is actually, it amounts to US forces stepping back from being as close to China as they were. Now, whether that's the US intention or not, I don't know, but it's a point that, for the sake of debate, could be made. I think that the defence relationship with Indonesia, of course, is huge in quantity and levels of activity and so on. I don't think there's ever a serious question of the joining five power, because of what they see as the history of five power, and rightly see as the history, it was to counter Indonesia, and it was a sort of a neo-colonial construct. So they're very, very unlikely to want to join that. That said, they do a lot of work themselves, increasingly with Singapore and Malaysia, on security in the Straits and safety of shipping in the Straits and so on, which is all encouraging. From our point of view, I think we need to have an intense relationship with the military leadership, because although formally it's no longer running that country, it is very instrumental in it still. I don't know who the contenders for the presidency are going to be next time around when the current general steps down, but it's likely to include in the field a couple of former generals, Prabowo among them, so that constituency still matters, and in other ways they're the only effective national institution from one end of the archipelago to the other, it's terribly important for us to know what their military leaders think. I think one point in that is that the military leadership, though, is not the sole or exclusive preserve of thinking in Indonesia about Indonesia's strategic interests, and I think we need to focus very hard on understanding what the military leadership thinks, but not overlook what other thinking is going on in the community in Indonesia, which is increasingly diverse. Miriam may know more about that history than I do, but I don't think it was so set pre-Taliban in the Soviet days. I don't think there was that much. Secondly, I think the numbers there, I mean, I'm hoping, I'm not saying it's set in stone, I'm just saying I'm hoping that there is enough momentum in all of that. The number of girls at school is what, I've forgotten the number, but several millions, and they're liking it. And the women who are in Parliament are doing it well, running their politics well. and have become an important part of that system. So, you know, it's not impossible, but I just think it's very hard to turn off those sorts of lights. It'll be a battle everywhere. I mean, there'll be, the battle will be with the Taliban, it'll be with religious fundamentalists who are not Taliban. The Hezbollah Islami people are gaining in political power in this very diverse political culture. They'll have candidates in the next election. I don't think they'll go to Sharia law, but they'll push back on women's rights. I think it's a constant play that's going to go on, led by people, even if they're not Taliban, believe fundamentally in those issues. So it's a push, but I do think maybe I'm too influenced by the civil society people I meet in Afghanistan. I think they're tremendously courageous. I think, but they are more confident than you might otherwise be. So yeah, I won't say it's set in stone, but I'm hopeful of that. Well, you're right to worry about Pakistan in lots of ways. I mean, there's a state of what, 180 million people now, estimated at 250 in another 20 years, and 55% of them will be under 15, or mad demographics, and enormous youth unemployment, a state education system which is not carrying anything like the load even at present, an economy which is still rooted in things like cotton and milk and water-dependent products, and very dependent still on emigre labour. These are not the stable bases for Pakistan. Trying to explain how Pakistan hangs together is extremely difficult. You go back a bit in history, my own view is that the petition was a giant bluff, which Nehru and Patel called, and I think it was probably a tragedy, but it's shaped that part of the world infinitely. When the Muslim League became the government, it went in there with 2 respected civilians only. The rest of the political leadership that had been nurtured in late colonial period stayed in India, and only Liaquat Ali Khan and Jinnah stayed, and they were both dead within 2 years. And so there's been a decided absence of leadership through all of this. Trying to explain how Pakistan hangs together, I couldn't do better than recommend a recent book called Pakistan, a Hard Country, by Anatole Levine. And he answers the question in part for me by saying, yes, a weak state and a weak economy, but a very strong society, both at the elite level and the community level through religion in part, and a very strong black economy. The governor of the Reserve Bank of Pakistan told me a year ago that in Karachi, the black economy is about 70% bigger than the official economy. So it's those 2 things that keep the place going as it is, but they're not recipes for a long-term future, because the weight of a failing economy will outweigh the black economy, and the weight of a staggering state will outweigh the ability of even a strong society to provide the levels of education and justice that are required there. You're right absolutely about the border. I mean, it's not just civil society in Afghanistan and Pakistan now. It goes back to the British in the 19th century who couldn't manage that border. And the border they drew, the Durand line, runs right through the Pushtun community here, which is spread on both sides of the line. Now, if you think Israel-Palestine is hard, or Kashmir, just try talking about redrawing that boundary. Somehow they have to make do with something pretty much like what they've got. How do they do that? I think, through the last 3 years in this special envoy job, which includes Pakistan as well as Afghanistan, I have been talking to Pakistanis. Now, I know that the security relationship is critical to the United States, and that's right, and the US puts in a lot, and we do too. We train something like 140 Pakistani soldiers in Australia each year, officers. What's the purpose of that? Well, it's, get to know them, but also to give them a proper professional secular education. And if you want a secular education, we're better to come than this godforsaken land. But that's what we're doing. That's good. But my focus has been on talking to them about economic change. And what the only prospect for Pakistan, in my view, is to integrate with the Indian economy. How is it that this staggering, struggling economy, only 2% of its official merchandise trade is with India, the second fastest growing economy in the world? How did that come about? In 1947 it was 100%. It's now 2%. Of course there's some other black market trade that will grow that number. But it's a ludicrous figure. And I've made the point throughout to Pakistanis and to Indians, because their focus is elsewhere, that the secret to what has happened in East Asia over the last generation has been open economies and economic integration. A view that says to enrich my neighbour is to enrich myself. But what we're faced with in the subcontinent, a view that says to beggar my neighbour is good. And that's still the framework in which they're operating. Now, in East Asia, economic integration, economic decision-making has been a primary concern to, and security and sovereignty issues have been subordinated for more than a generation. Somehow, India and Pakistan have got to get to that point where you can start talking about a greater South Asian economy. India will survive without it, but it won't survive as easily if Pakistan doesn't survive. Bangladesh is starting to respond, Sri Lanka is recovering. The makings are there for this great South Asian economy, and we've had people like Peter Drysdale and others who contributed so much to the East Asian experience, talking to Pakistanis, doing papers and so on to try to get this. Now the business community in Pakistan gets it, that's the good news. In Karachi, the Chamber of Commerce, which is mostly Muhajirs, that is people who come from Gujarat and their families came in petition, they're looking over the border in Gujarat and seeing 10% growth a year in that state. And they're starting to ask, well, why can't we do this? And they're right to. That's the hope. In Lahore, they would love to open up the borders and start driving their trucks backwards and forwards. They know what can be done in Lahore that isn't done in India and Punjab, and what can be interchanged. They know the trading environment, but the political barriers to it, imposed by this sort of focus on security and Kashmir, and driven by this sort of beggar thy neighbour kind of approach, are inhibiting it. Well, we'll keep at it. Keep at it, keep at it. And in the last year, tiny little steps have been taken, but they're better than none. India has given Pakistan most favoured nation status, or some tiny thing, but they haven't for 40 years, so that's something. And trade delegations are going, and they're working on some immensely complicated formula, like certain numbers of trucks through the border each day. But these are beginnings, and we've just got to, as I've said in there, the government doesn't have to lead at this time. Get your business community fired up, get good institutional support from the universities and so on, the same way as East Asia began around PBEC, led by chambers of commerce, backed by universities, then governments came. But the market can help shape this. So Pakistan's a hell of a long answer, Brian, but it's a lot to worry about. Worry about the economy, but don't lose any sleep about the Durand line. It is too hard. And they are tough people. Look, it is the most wicked political problem of our generation domestically. It's actually more difficult, probably, is a big statement, than climate change, because people are so entrenched in this. And as I see it, there's a triangle there. There's a strong will among parts of the Australian community to take a more humanitarian and generous approach, and the government, and that view is strongly represented in the current governing party and indeed in some parts of the opposition. There's a second point in this triangle, which is a very different view, which, if I believe the media in Canberra, is rooted in Western Sydney or somewhere, that says, no, this has got to stop. We can't have all these people flooding into our country. And there's a third point of the triangle, which is called international law. And for a government to place itself in that triangle, work out a viable policy that's going to please enough of the people enough of the time and work is just impossible. You asked my view. All right, two things. One, I would have no difficulty with accepting many more refugees into this country, and I think you could take a very positive approach to that in frankly socially engineering the areas of work they go into, because that's what we need. But I also have a visceral hatred of people smugglers because I saw them in Indonesia. These are truly dreadful people, and anything that can bust their business and take them out of play has got to be good. These are awful people who are taking $4,000 and $5,000 a head off people going to sea in boats that they're pretty sure will sink. And I just find that very hard to cop. And so, you know, I'm in that triangle too, bumping around from one point to another, like many Australians are. Yeah, no, I assume that that's what it's about too. I mean, it is unusual enough to bring on a new white paper just 4 years after the last one. Especially now in the circumstances of the fiscal circumstances the government defined, is going to be a very different allocation of money.
Yeah.
Our aspirations will have to be better, different. You know, my view for a long time, and especially since I was Secretary of Defence, has been that all governments actually spend on defence what they can afford. Why is China growing its armed forces? Because it can. It can. It's got all that money. Its GDP is growing, government revenue is growing faster than GDP, and the PLA will want at least the same share of the pie as it's always had. No political leadership in China could deny that. Sure. So they'll go on spending. You trace defence spending in other countries, and although it's growing in most of the countries of our region, it's generally pretty steady as a proportion of GDP. When I last did any analysis on this for defence spending in 2007 across the region, I found then that only 2 countries were spending on defence at a rate faster than the growth of their GDP. One was China and the other was Australia. Now, we will fall out of that category. We are now. But that's what they do. They spend what they can, and our government has decided, or will decide, an envelope, I expect. And someone, defence organisation, will have to design a set of capabilities, a force structure that fits within that.
Not easy.
Not easy, because there'll be lots of losers. And I'll be in the enviable or unenviable position of saying, gee, that's interesting, I don't agree, or I do agree, but...
not 12 submarines.
Not in the near future. I think personally, the first step with the submarines that they invest in will be to get the current 6 operating properly again. Yeah. Mediation, I think that's what they'll do. And that can be done because they're not immensely complicated problems. They're drivetrain problems, not weapon systems problems. And with a smarter engine and frankly a Japanese diesel, not a Swedish one, you could probably do that. But they need to do that before they start trying to rebuild another one.